During the 2024 Democratic National Convention, Vice President and presidential nominee Kamala Harris, 10 months into Israel's brutal campaign of bombing, starvation, and displacement in Gaza, reiterated, as many presidents before her have, that the U.S. is unequivocal in its support of and arming of the State of Israel.
And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself.
She followed this up with some empty platitudes about caring for the safety of the Palestinian people, who she just declared would continue to be killed by bombs supplied by America. But amongst all the death, she kind of shoehorned in something peculiar.
Because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival.
Israel's violence here is being juxtaposed with Hamas's violence. But the focus is not so much on the killing and the hostage-taking as it is on the sexual violence. That is very intentional. On October 7th, Hamas attacked Israeli settlers, killing many and taking dozens of hostages. The death toll at the time was reported as being around 1,400, and the news was filled with stories about atrocities like mass rape and the beheading of babies. That was what Israel told the world as they used this campaign as a justification for a genocidal extermination campaign that has already taken tens of thousands of lives, perhaps hundreds of thousands, with 70% of the victims being women and children, as well as displacing millions. While I was making this video, Haaretz released an estimated death toll of 40,000, noting that this is still likely a massive underestimation, with a projected death toll closer to 200,000 in a Lancet report. Western journalists, eager to find justification for the violence of our ally in the region, ran stories with graphic descriptions based on unevidenced accounts that described extreme incidents of child murder and sexual violence. These stories were utilized alongside long-standing narratives in the West that position Arab people as savage and violent. As the months have worn on, many of the more extreme claims, like babies being beheaded or thrown in ovens, have been found to be lies. But lies still repeated uncritically by the President of the United States for months.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
The number of dead on October 7th has also shrunk, suggesting that there have been significant exaggerations concerning the details of the attack. Not only have early Israeli reports of death tolls been found to be inaccurate, Haaretz and other outlets have recently reported that Israel utilized something called the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. The Hannibal Directive is a policy of avoiding Israeli capture at all costs, and in practice means that efforts to save hostages that result in the death of the hostage are preferable to allowing their capture. If that sounds messed up to you, you are correct. This was reported on many months before it was officially confirmed, based on the language and tactics used by the IDF, which have resulted in a large number of the dead on October 7th actually having been killed by the IDF. This was called an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory at the time by Israeli nationalists. Now a verified fact. As for how many the IDF killed, we don't really know. Israel has restricted access for international observers and routinely murdered journalists who might have been able to report on what they've done since October 7th and before. And the same problem plagues stories about supposed mass rapes carried out by Hamas on the day. We simply do not know how much of that is true, based on the fact that the main source we have right now is Israel, and judging by the veracity of their initial claims about October 7th so far, I think it is reasonable to assume that the image created of this mass sexual violence is likely exaggerated. However, and I think my reasoning behind this will be clear as the video goes on, I would argue that we can make an educated guess that there was still some sexual violence, not only because of a report published by the United Nations Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict that stated there were, quote, reasonable grounds to believe sexual violence had taken place, although Israel has not been cooperative with international efforts to investigate this, but also sexual violence is almost unavoidable during military operations around civilian populations, and it is simultaneously invaluable to aggressor nations as a propaganda tool. That is part of why it is especially important to meet events that are used to justify military escalations with scrutiny, and not be swayed into backing the massacre of civilians with sensationalist atrocity stories. But these stories are not new. This is, in fact, a well-established method of garnering public support for a war. Many scholars, including Nicoletta Gulacsi, a historian who focuses on the treatment of women in war, trace this propaganda tactic back to the First World War. Germany's invasion of Belgium was a clear breach of international treaties and constituted plenty of justification for Britain to go to war as per their Treaty of London obligations. The trouble was, a lot of regular working-class people, the people you need to actually go fight your war for you, didn't really care about old treaties between rulers of different nations. Certainly not enough to go and, do World War I about it. And so, like so many terrible stories, this brings us to the British press. The press was working closely with the state because the British state was smart enough to realize they could get further with a light touch of censorship, simply informing the papers what would be acceptable to publish rather than shutting them down entirely like the Germans did after the war began. As a result, reporting that was effectively stenography for the War Office was still able to appear somewhat organic, even keeping the time-honored British tradition of posting ludicrously unfounded claims with zero evidence. The papers concocted what came to be known as the Rape of Belgium, a campaign of atrocity stories about the mass murder and rape of civilians carried out by the invading German army, with claims as outlandish as the infamous corpse factory in which the German army was supposedly boiling their war dead down into soap. That didn't happen, in case that needs stating. That one was brought to us by the Daily Mail, by the way, and some argue that it helped inspire the design of Nazi concentration camps later, so thanks for that, lads. There is, however, ample evidence of executions and sexual violence carried out by German soldiers against civilians in Belgium. That's part of what made the story of the Rape of Belgium so effective. It was an exaggeration of things that actually happened, making it out to be far more widespread than it was, and warning British men that their wives could be next if they don't enlist. This has the dual effect of also encouraging British women to pressure their husbands and sons into enlistment, contributing to the practice of women shaming men who didn't enlist by publicly presenting them with a white feather. After all, you saw that giant ape, that could be me next. Now at this point, you might be saying sexual violence in war is much, much older than the First World War, and you'd be right. Wartime rape was incredibly commonplace throughout the Middle Ages. So much so that the Pope tried unsuccessfully to ban it in the 10th century, likely knowing full well that such an edict would not be realistically enforceable. But it goes back much further than that, too. The ancient Greeks considered women to be part of the plunder of war. It was not only acceptable amongst men, but it was seen as impressive for a returning soldier to have taken a large amount of both treasure and women. There's never been a patriarchal society in which women were not uniquely brutalized by warfare. Today, women obviously enjoy far more rights and social standing, but they are still objectified culturally, which continues to shape how they are treated during war. Objectification is a process that requires some attention here. It is hardly a cutting-edge feminist critique to say that women are often treated not as human beings, but as objects. But what is the nature of those objects? Objects of desire and attraction, certainly, but, and this is where things get a little interesting, not all objects are valued equally by society. Just as a handcrafted armchair has greater social, cultural, and economic value than, say, one of those mass-produced plastic chairs you find at McDonald's, women are not just rendered objects by societal objectification, they are often very highly valued objects. Obtaining a wife has long been a key step in securing status and respectability for a man. It's difficult to point to a period in recent centuries where a middle-aged man who had never taken a wife is not looked upon as having failed or fallen short in some way. The simple act of placing an image of a beautiful woman next to a product is enough to constitute an effective ad, and it clearly works because it has been a constant marketing strategy since at least the 1930s. The woman as object is a complicated figure because she is an object that at times seems to be more highly prized than the lives of men. It is noteworthy that all the Belgian soldiers and male civilians being killed by the Germans were not seen as adequate motivation to spur British men to war. The papers specifically focused on the harm done to women. But even a highly prized object is still an object, not a full person. The paternalistic message behind this kind of rhetoric is that women are a sort of collective property of the nation that needs to be protected from a dangerous other. What was new about propaganda in the First World War, although it had developed out of colonial rhetoric the century prior, was this notion of the enemy as a subhuman brute who is a threat to our pure, virginal white women. Implicit in this framing is that we, in this case the British, would never do something like that. We conduct war properly, according to the rules, not like those barbarous murderers and rapists. The racial undertones of this rhetoric become apparent the more you look at British wartime posters, with Germans often depicted either as apes or with dark skin, even down to calling them Huns. They are rendered something Asiatic, something non-white, an external threat to what the British are assumed to see themselves in, whiteness. As a side note, it is an incredible study in how fluid whiteness can be when the Germans, some of the whitest people to ever do it, don't get to be fully white when they are not adhering to the norms of liberal international law. But the language of a non-white savage race constantly threatening the periphery of your nation was well established in the British mind at this point, with anxieties about protecting white women often at the forefront of concerns about keeping those colonials in their place. This brings us back to Palestine. Stories of sexual violence have been used to justify wars more times than I can count, since the First World War alone. So when Israel began bombing civilians and the news was flooded with stories of these evil savages raping our beautiful white women, it was hard not to see a very well-worn playbook being enacted, exactly as it has been countless times before. On February 9th, 2024, 4 months after October 7th, 4 months into a near constant stream of atrocities carried out by Israel in retaliation, Hillary Clinton spoke at a Columbia University panel on sexual violence against women during war. She said wartime sexual violence should be viewed as the global problem that it is, but sadly, it is nothing new, citing recent conflicts in Sudan, Darfur, and Ukraine, as well as the October 7th attack on Israel.
We have seen an epidemic, an alarming epidemic of gender-based violence as a weapon of war. We see it in Sudan and Darfur, we see it in the DRC, we see it in Ukraine, we see it in Israel on October 7th.
Omitting, of course, the reports of sexual violence carried out by the IDF before and after October 7th. 2 details about her statement stand out. The first is that she curiously chose conflicts in which the U.S. is not a participant, and was careful not to indict a U.S. ally when mentioning Israel. Second, Hillary has been a consistent advocate for war throughout her political career. Clinton, due to the length and success of her career, aside from that one time, is a useful representative for a wider ideological trend that has been called imperialist feminism. And it necessarily holds deeply conflicting viewpoints. Clinton was an ardent supporter of the Iraq War, in which U.S. soldiers infamously raped Iraqi civilians and Iraqi POWs, as well as refusing to investigate claims of torture and rape carried out by U.S.-backed Iraqi forces. She also strongly supported these wars in her role as Senator and Secretary of State. Every single one of these wars included rape. And in the case of Libya, in which she very vocally supported and celebrated the overthrow and killing of Gaddafi,
we came, we saw, he died.
That country now has a large and vibrant slave trade. It is difficult to even begin to calculate the amount of sexual violence that has happened and is continuing to happen as a result of that war and that US-backed overthrow alone. There are very few individual women alive right now who have done more to directly aid in the creation of mass sexual violence than Hillary Clinton in her political career. And she gets to stand up on this stage and decry the horror of war rape. The internal logic of this worldview requires the women of other nations to be expendable, to be objects, to abuse and discard. Meanwhile, the facade of feminism draped over the bloodthirsty logic of empire implies a protection for our women, but still not a personhood. They remain a national property to be kept out of the hands of the savage other. That is the feminism of the people on this stage. But there's a question left unanswered here. Could people like Clinton have known the wars they supported would lead to sexual violence? The inevitability of rape in war is actually a point of contention. Many feminist writers decry the notion that sexual violence is an inevitable consequence of war as a sort of patriarchal justification or dismissal of women's safety, positioning the victim of war rape as collateral damage. Professor of Criminology Victoria Canning endorses this position, but highlights that despite increased legal recognition of war rape as a war crime, especially after the 1990s conflicts in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, there's been stunningly little progress in terms of actual enforcement or consequences for these acts. Sociologist Martin Shaw argues that war is an institutional social practice, meaning actions like rape are not exclusively individual acts. They are the outcome of cultural and social elements of the military institutions required for war to even occur. So the real question here is, can these institutions that make war do so in a way that does not lend itself to acts of sexual violence on invaded and occupied populations? Canning's endorsement of greater legal protections and enforcement of existing laws protecting women implicitly argues that such a thing is possible. But imperial feminists certainly argue even more explicitly for the notion of a rapeless war. In fact, in my research for this video, I came upon a number of articles like this one by Kathleen Kunest, a director at the United States Institute of Peace, formerly of the World Bank, who argues that sexual violence is not an inevitable outcome of military conflict. She bases this on the fact that some armed groups engage in sexual violence while others do not, or that some conflicts feature a great deal of sexual violence while others feature less or even none. These are not very strong arguments. Different conflicts and different armed groups will have different amounts of contact time with civilian populations in very different conditions. The fact that sexual violence does not always occur means it is not guaranteed in every interaction. But that does not mean war can be reliably carried out without it happening. The United States Institute of Peace is a creation of the Reagan administration that generally toes the U.S. state line on foreign nations the U.S. is hostile to, and it is in the best interest of the United States, perhaps the greatest warmonger on earth, to promote the idea of a clean war. A war in which all the rules are followed, even a feminist war, even though the U.S. has certainly never managed to orchestrate one. The sociologist Antonio Souza Ribeiro provides a great perspective on this question, arguing that for war to be carried out, it is necessary for the institutional transformation of the enemy's body into something freely available to be infringed on by combatants. saying this is inscribed in the deepest logic of military confrontation. In other words, you cannot condition a group of soldiers to kill another group of people without also creating the preconditions for sexual violence. If it is okay for you to murder someone, it is simply not a great leap to it also being okay to enact other kinds of violence upon them. I think the history of war and the dehumanization necessary to carry it out lends far more credit to this argument than the dubious notion that if we just manage our armies really well, we can invade and kill enemy populations without any other bad things happening. As if that were even a particularly desirable outcome. There's also very little reason to think it's realistic. The fact that war consistently brings sexual violence with it must be understood alongside Canning's arguments about poor enforcement of existing laws against it. To a certain degree, this is by design. The US has a habit of making examples of individual bad actors when an instance of sexual violence gets too much media attention. The My Lai massacre, in which US soldiers murdered hundreds of Vietnamese civilians while also raping dozens of women and children, was covered up for years before the press attention became impossible to ignore. Despite dozens of soldiers being directly involved, only one man was sentenced, William Cayley, who served a whopping 3 years of house arrest. The spectacle of this case served in some ways to distract from the many other incidents of murder and rape of civilians carried out by US soldiers, while giving a single, quite pathetic prosecution to point to for legitimacy, as if to say, see, we prosecute people who do these things. The rape and murder of a teenage girl and her family in Mahmadiyah during the Iraq War played out similarly, although the perpetrators who were convicted received far more severe sentences this time. This war crime followed the same process of attempted cover-up before prosecuting only once it became impossible to ignore. There has been no indication that many of the numerous other known cases of sexual violence throughout the Iraq War will ever be investigated properly. The message is clear. If you're an American soldier, you can expect impunity for rape and other war crimes, unless you're unlucky enough to be involved in the rare incident that makes serious headlines. This point is underscored by the Hague Invasion Act in the US, which posits that the US can and will use military force to prevent American personnel being tried in international courts. They are declaring to the world, we will decide when to prosecute our own war crimes. And by making examples of a tiny number of offenders, they attempt to perpetuate the idea that the West generally does not do these things, but our enemies do. Remember the British in World War I. This is a well-established strategy. And US allies also enjoy a unique impunity. Their allies are so accustomed to being allowed to murder and rape without consequence that Israel recently experienced a wave of riots in response to a severely lukewarm attempt to even investigate a few Israeli troops accused of rape, publicly arguing for a right to rape.
עוד פעם זה מעניין לי את העכוז מה עשו לאיש חמאס הזה. אני כל הזמן זוכר, קודם כל הדבר היחיד שמבחינתי הוא בעיה פה, זה שזו לא איזושהי מדיניות מוסדרת של המדינה להתעלל בעצירים, כי בגדול זה גם קודם כל מגיע להם, וזה אחלה נקמה שאנחנו צריכים.
A position that is apparently mainstream enough to be passionately argued for on Israeli television. They even brought one of the accused rapists on TV to stand there looking very normal. Any army able to do their job as an army and take the lives of a given population will also be capable and arguably even inclined to commit sexual violence. And if they are allied to the primary global superpower, they can and clearly do expect not to be punished for it. The only position on warfare that reliably prioritizes the safety of women is opposition to war itself, and indeed, opposition to settler occupations that make such violence equally inevitable, a position that many of the people on this stage have shown utter contempt for. Hillary's statements were interrupted by student protesters chanting, "Free Palestine." protesting a war that Hillary and the Columbia University administration support. A war that is leading to even more sexual violence, not just directly at the hands of the IDF, but by pushing millions of Palestinian women into extremely vulnerable positions that expose them to exploitation and violence of all kinds. The extent of the harm caused to the Palestinian population beyond the immediate death toll will be a point of discussion, calculation, and horror for years to come. But no matter how hard it is to believe, the narrative that we and our allies can wage just wars, that these terrible crimes are primarily only carried out by the other, by our geopolitical opponents, that story requires this incredible cognitive dissonance. 2 months later, Columbia University would bring the police onto their campus to arrest, assault, and injure those student protesters who opposed Israel's genocidal war on Palestine, showing the quality of the university admin's commitment to the safety of women everywhere. War is fundamentally in contradiction with the stated values of liberal society, while being quite necessary to maintain its economic demands. Selectively harping about war crimes is part of how we try to maintain that dissonance, while murdering and, yes, raping, often with impunity, all while simultaneously denouncing our enemies for doing the same.
Briefly and reconvene in a moment. We embrace freedom of expression at Columbia University. This is a violation of the university rules of conduct, as it's a disruption of an academic proceeding. Thank you for making your way out of the event space.